I guess in this video what I'm trying to do is tell my story. I would like to say sorry to my family and my friends, and I promise I'll be back.
On a chilly November night in Toronto, Tess Richey went out for drinks, danced with her friends, and then never came home. At first, it looked like a case we've heard way too many times before. A young woman vanishes after a night on the town. But what happened next was way more sinister and way more frustrating too. While her family desperately looked for her, putting up flyers, calling hospitals, and pleading for help, the police pretty much dismissed their worries. The cops thought she'd probably just gone off to blow off some steam. But sadly, they couldn't have been more wrong. 4 days later, it wasn't the police who found Tess. It was her own mom. And the discovery she made was every parent's worst nightmare. But the tragedy doesn't end there, because eventually security camera footage would reveal a bunch of scary details. And those details would uncover a horrible crime with a terrible man behind it. A man Tess had trusted that night. Someone who went from a stranger to charming to dangerous in just a few minutes. Meanwhile, everyone on the outside saw him as a hero. Now, calling him a wolf in sheep's clothing doesn't really cover it. Because what you're about to see is one of the most disturbing changes from, well, a hero to one of Canada's most hated names. So with that, welcome back to CD Crime Diaries. Today we're looking at the heartbreaking case of Tess Richey, a small-time YouTuber who died from the things she was most afraid of. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe for more true crime videos. This is the case of Tess Richey. Before we get deeper into what happened that night, let's first take a minute to talk about who Tess Richey really was. Born on November 30th, 1994, in North Bay, Ontario, Tess grew up in a busy, loving family with lots of brothers and sisters. She also had 2 dogs named Phil and Pearl who meant the world to her. And that's not just something to say because Tess was the kind of person who would do anything to help any living thing. She was a proud animal lover, really passionate about animal rights and known for sticking up for them in every part of her life. She had also studied at George Brown College, focusing on counseling for assaulted women and children, which shows just how much she cared about other people too. As you can see, Tess didn't just believe in equality, she lived it. And she was ready to make this her personal and career path going forward. So she studied counseling for assaulted women and children because she wanted to make a difference for those who needed it most. And she was willing to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. But the really sad thing here is that while she saw the good in people, she would also end up facing the evil and dark side too. We can see a little bit of this from her YouTube channel. You see, even when she was young, she made content online just silly, fun YouTube videos that showed her funny and goofy side. But as she got older, her channel and the reason behind it seemed to change. And the skits she used to make turned into something deeper and more personal. And in one of those videos, Tess opened up about something that was really raw and painful for her. She talked about a time that had clearly hurt her, a moment when her ex-boyfriend had assaulted her. As someone who stood up for victims, Tess had now sadly become one herself. This wasn't something she could have ever controlled, but even so, she said she felt embarrassed and even ashamed about it. The video wasn't for show, it was brave. She talked about the pain, the emotional scars, and how it followed her every day. It was a small look at the real Tess, vulnerable, but still strong.
I guess in this video what I'm trying to do is tell my story. Because I know for me, when I was going through this, I was searching everywhere I could, trying to find somewhere where somebody would understand and be able to get what I was going through. And now I'm sitting here by myself and so confused and hurt why I let him have so much control. Sorry to my family. I'm so sorry. I was on the floor and I couldn't move. And he grabbed me by my chest and pulled up and he spit in my face and threw me back down.
And in one of her more powerful and emotional videos, Tess defended a woman's right to feel confident and do what she wanted.
If I had lower self-esteem, I would probably be starving myself right now. But that's exactly what is happening to other women all over this country. So I have something to say. To all of you that have something nasty to say about me or other women that are built like me, women that sometimes or all the time look like this, women whose names you know, women whose names you don't, women who've been picked on, women whose husbands put them down, women at work or girls in school, I have one thing to say to you. Kiss my fat ass!
Now, things did seem to settle down after these two videos. And it turns out that the program Tess had taken at college wasn't right for her either. With that, she made a total change of scene and also decided to switch to something a little different. Changing direction, she went into flight services at Seneca College, dreaming of being a flight attendant and seeing the world. I get the feeling here that Tess never wanted to stay still, that she wanted to experience everything and help people along the way. At one point, she even moved to British Columbia for a seasonal job planting trees while getting back to nature. And when that was done, she then came back to Toronto, living downtown while figuring out her next adventure. I think Tess wasn't really sure what to do next. Maybe it was in the arts or even modeling. Whatever it was going to be, she had that spark to make it happen. Her friends said she was gorgeous, expressive, and creative. She loved pearls, makeup, fashion, and thrift store shopping, and was also known to be a big runner. And when she wasn't out doing marathons, she was often behind a camera, into her passion for photography. For those who knew Tess best, she was described as warm, funny, and, well, a little stubborn. And although she could be tough sometimes, she was also incredibly trustworthy and loving. So when she suddenly stopped answering any messages or phone calls on November 25, 2017, her family immediately knew something was wrong. I know I say this a lot, but this really wasn't like Tess at all. I mean, with her being so careful and protective about women's safety, she would always share her live location with friends and family, but not this time. So where did she go? That's when Tess's family got in touch with the police. But if anyone was counting on the police to do their job and find her quickly, well, they were in for a bitter disappointment. The date was November 24, 2017. It was a Friday, and the night started like so many others in downtown Toronto. The air was cold, fairy lights were hanging overhead, and music came from the doors of packed bars. Meanwhile, people were getting away from the work week with drinks, dancing, and late-night laughs. Tess was out with a close friend that evening, a friend named Riley Simmons. She had called Riley to help her forget about a few things. Unfortunately, Tess had just broken up with her boyfriend, and she needed some comfort. Wanting to distract herself from the heartbreak, the two headed to Cruise and Tango's for a drink or two, which is a well-known gay bar in the Church and Wellesley neighborhood of the city. It has a lively spot known for its inclusive atmosphere and a dance floor that stays packed until the early morning. The next part is a key detail for later in the video. But for Tess, who identified as bisexual, it was a familiar and welcoming place. The two women spent their evening at Cruise drinking and hanging out with people around them. But as the night went on, they ran into a man, someone neither of them had ever seen before. The man's name was Kalen Schlatter, and at the time he seemed like just another friendly stranger, charming, charismatic, and fitting in with the crowd. You see, he also identified as bisexual. But unlike Tess and her openness, it was something he tried to keep quiet. At just 21 years old, Kalen was out by himself. But Tess, who was always kind and open, decided to bring him into their conversation. Both she and Riley talked with him. And at some point after 1 a.m. that morning, the three of them left Cruise and Tango's together, with Riley calling an Uber home shortly after. About 2 hours later, around 3 a.m., the pair were seen on a security camera walking near Dundonald Street, a quiet residential area, which is just a few minutes from the club. You can see from this grainy video that the two stopped near a house that was being fixed up. It was here that they paused and hung around the area while they figured out what to do next. It's worth pointing out that at this time, Tess had actually called an Uber, but for some reason or another, Tess and Kalen then went towards the house that was under construction, and then nothing. This was the last time Tess was seen alive. After that, she just vanished. Within just a few hours, Rachel knew something must have happened to her sister. You see, Tess would always share her live location when going out at night. And she would usually keep the texts coming too, but this time, nothing. By sunrise, those red flags were impossible to ignore. Tess hadn't come home, hadn't posted anything on social media, and hadn't read any of Rachel's messages. And for someone who was pretty much glued to her phone 24/7, that was really alarming. It was at that moment that Rachel decided to call their mother, and both gripped by fear, they decided to contact the authorities. But like I said, if you think the police were going to do anything about this in good time, you'd be wrong. You have to remember here that at that point nobody had seen the security footage yet. The call came in on a frigid February morning. Tess, a vibrant 24-year-old with a promising future, was missing. Her car was found abandoned on a lonely stretch of highway. Keys still in the ignition, her purse and phone left behind on the passenger seat. It was as if she had simply vanished into the biting winter air. Friends and family described Tess as reliable and cautious. She would never just leave her car, especially not in the middle of nowhere on a freezing day. The last anyone heard from her was a text to her roommate saying she was on her way home from visiting a friend. She was just 20 minutes away, a route she'd driven 100 times before. So what happened in those 20 minutes? Police immediately launched a full-scale investigation. They canvassed the area where her car was found, a desolate spot surrounded by dense woods and a frozen lake. Search parties scoured the landscape, their breath pluming in the cold, calling her name until their voices were hoarse. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing stark, snowy images, but there was no sign of Tess. Investigators dug into her life, looking for any clue, any hint of trouble. Was there a secret she was keeping? An ex-boyfriend with a grudge? A financial problem? But her life appeared to be an open book. She was a beloved preschool teacher, close with her family, and had a tight-knit circle of friends. Everyone who knew her was baffled and heartbroken. There were no enemies, no shady dealings, nothing to suggest she was in any danger. The case quickly captured the public's attention. Tess's smiling face was everywhere on news channels, social media, and flyers stapled to telephone poles. A community, united in hope and fear, held vigils, praying for her safe return. The police tip line was flooded with calls, but most led to dead ends. A few reported seeing a dark-colored truck near her car around the time she disappeared, but the descriptions were vague and inconsistent. Days turned into weeks, and the hope that had once burned so brightly began to flicker. The investigation stalled. With no forensic evidence in the car and no credible witnesses, police were at a standstill. It was the kind of case that haunts investigators, a person disappearing without a trace, leaving behind a million questions and no answers. Then, nearly 3 months later, as the spring thaw began to melt the snow, a hiker made a devastating discovery in the woods, about 2 miles from where Tess's car had been found. It was Tess. The tragic end to the search sent a shockwave of grief through the community. Now, the question was no longer, where is Tess? But who did this to her? The autopsy revealed the cause of death was blunt force trauma, confirming everyone's worst fears. This was a homicide. The discovery of her body, however, provided few new leads. The elements had taken their toll, washing away potential evidence. The case went cold, but her family and the lead detective refused to give up. For years, they kept her story alive, pushing for answers, believing that someone, somewhere knew what happened. Years passed. Life moved on for most, but for Tess's loved ones, time was frozen on that cold February day. The detective, now nearing retirement, would often pull out her case file, going over the same scant details, hoping to see something he'd missed. And then, a breakthrough came from the most unexpected place. A new technology in DNA analysis allowed investigators to re-examine a tiny, previously insignificant piece of evidence found under Tess's fingernail. The sample was minuscule, and previous tests had been inconclusive. But now with this advanced technique, they got a hit. The DNA profile was matched to a man named Robert, a long-haul truck driver who had lived in the area at the time of Tess' disappearance, but had since moved several states away. He had a minor criminal record but had never been on the radar for this case. His name hadn't appeared in any of the original tips or interviews. When police brought him in, Robert denied everything. He claimed he'd never seen Tess, never been on that stretch of road. But the DNA evidence was irrefutable. As the detective laid out the facts, Robert's story began to crumble. He eventually confessed. He said it was a crime of opportunity. He'd seen her pull over, possibly for a flat tire, and offered to help. When she politely refused, something inside him snapped. It was a senseless, random act of violence that stole a precious life and shattered a family. Robert was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Justice after so many years was finally served. But for Tess's family, the verdict brought a somber sense of closure, not relief. Her empty chair at the dinner table would never be filled. Her bright laughter would never again echo through her parents' home. Tess' story is a heartbreaking reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of the ordinary. It is also a testament to the unwavering love of a family and the tireless dedication of law enforcement, who refused to let her become just another unsolved case file. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more true crime content. Stay safe out there. After Tess had been found at 582 Church Street, the Toronto Police Service finally stepped up their efforts. But for Tess's family and the rest of the community, this response came way too late. Their first reaction had already worn down the family's trust, making many people question the authorities' commitment and ability to protect vulnerable people. And to be honest with you, I don't blame the family at all. The police's efforts here were shocking. On December 1st, 2017, the autopsy results were finally released, showing that Tess had died from neck compression, which is a clear sign of murder. With that, this news made the homicide unit take over the case from the police. A move that was welcomed by, well, pretty much everyone. You could even see that the homicide investigation team was a lot more active. And from the moment they took over, things seemed to change. They were more driven, more caring, and way more effective. And in this video right here, which was taken on the day they announced a person of interest, you can even see how clear they wanted to make it that they were a different group.
The family's on very good terms with the members of my team, and my partner just spoke with the family today and actually met with them. And I speak to Tess's mother probably twice a week. We treat every case of equal importance, and we follow the leads until we hopefully can make an arrest, and if we can't, immediately we keep working on it until we get to that stage where we can hopefully make an arrest. So, I mean, this is the kind of case where obviously you want to make an arrest because it's very high profile, and you know, Tess was a young innocent girl who, you know, obviously nothing like this should have ever happened to anybody. But it took a lot of work, and everybody worked very hard. Like I said, the members of the team and also our support units in the service, and we were lucky to be able to come to this successful conclusion.
It was only 2 days later, on December 3rd, that new detectives got security footage from the surrounding area. This newly found video showed Tess with an unknown man between 2 and 5 a.m. on the night she disappeared. And of course, as we know, that would later turn out to be Kaylin Schlatter. To try and identify Kaylin, police released pictures to the public on December 10th, asking for Toronto's help. The community's response was both quick and huge, with many tips now pointing toward Kaylin. But before they could even get a hold of him, it would be Kaylin himself who decided to come forward. So this is where things take a turn. And not just for the strange, but the downright sneaky. Even though Kaylin had come forward to say he was the man in those pictures, he wasn't really ready to cooperate fully. While on the phone with Kaylin, detectives asked him if he was willing to come down to the police station for an interview. And even though he agreed, he would only do it if his mom and dad were with him. After getting there, he was then asked if he would give any kind of formal statement. And that's when Kaylin clammed up and used his right to remain silent. Now, pretty understandably, this was seen as an uncooperative move by the detectives. But then again, we are all told to get a lawyer before we talk. You see, Kaylin's parents were really eager to show how amazing their son was. And so, when they came with him down to the police station, they brought a basket loaded with baked cookies. Of course, handing it to the officers while reminding them that he was a hero only a few months before. But what they didn't realize was that while they were trying to sweeten up the room, they accidentally gave the officers exactly what they needed. As the family left the station, detectives noticed Kaylin putting an empty drink bottle into a nearby trash can. And just like that, they had leveraged DNA. The bottle was taken and then sent for DNA testing. And of course, if what they suspected was true, well, then this evidence would blow the case wide open. And that's because, tragically, semen had been found on Tess's body. And so, if the DNA evidence taken from that drink bottle matched that sample, well, then they very likely had her killer. So who exactly was Kaylin Schlatter? Well, on paper, he actually seemed like a nice guy. Known to police not as a criminal, but as a good Samaritan instead. Only a few months before Tess's death, he made headlines for running to help a man who'd been attacked with a hammer just outside his family home. Not only did Kaylin manage to scare off the attacker, but he also called the police and even gave first aid to the victim. On the inside, his parents proudly described him as kind, respectful, and well-mannered. And his friends would say he was sweet, funny, and a little quirky. At just 21 years old, Kaylin worked in property maintenance, mostly doing outside repairs and landscaping. Before Tess's murder, there was no prior record and no red flags. And on the surface, Kaylin seemed to be like any other normal guy. But during the investigation, when people started to realize she had been murdered, a much darker truth began to come out. Because Kaylin wasn't just someone with a rough edge. He was a man with deeply disturbing sexual fixations. Fixations that especially focused on a fetish for choking women. And this wasn't just found from his shady internet search history, but it would also come from the mouths of several of his old partners. In fact, one of Kaylin's ex-partners would even come forward to tell officers that he admitted to her that he got sexually excited by strangling women. Not only that, but he also told her that he never went through with it because he didn't trust himself to stop. She also said that he would regularly push the limits of what was okay in the bedroom, often being too rough or aggressive, and even not taking no for an answer. With this information in hand and a bunch of other evidence which will get to in a little while, Kaylin was officially arrested on February 4, 2018, and charged with first-degree murder. But the interesting thing here is that the most damning piece of evidence wouldn't come from DNA or security footage. It would come from Kaylin's own mouth, and all of this would come out through a police sting operation. While waiting for his trial, undercover officers acted as inmates in a nearby cell. And over time, Kaylin started to get cocky. Kaylin talked about all kinds of creepy stuff, including how much he liked violent sex and how he enjoyed talking women into it. He would even describe choking as a turn-on, which sure has its place for some people, but this was definitely not the right time to admit it. So is Kaylin really a good Samaritan or more like a predator in the dark? So, before we get to the courtroom, let's first quickly go back to the night Tess was murdered. On November 24, 2017, Tess and Riley headed out to cruise and tangos where they partied into the early morning. At some point that night, they met Kaylin. On the surface, he didn't seem to raise any red flags, but security footage would later show he had been prowling Church Street all evening. Security cameras caught him roaming the area, approaching several women and not just casually. He was pushy and often invasive. Several women would later come forward to say they had rejected him that night. He had hit on them, tried to start conversations, and often stuck around way too long when they said no. It was the same man who would ultimately latch onto Tess and her friend. Sometime around 1:30 a.m., Tess and Riley left the club with Kaylin in tow. Riley had been drinking and started to feel sick, so she decided to call an Uber and head home. The ride came a little while later, but as Riley got in, Tess chose to stay behind with Kaylin while she waited for her own cab back. From there, security footage tracked Tess and Kaylin walking north. The two stopped at a 24-hour hot dog stand and then eventually made their way toward Dundonald Street, a quiet block just a few minutes away. But what Tess didn't realize was that this wasn't just a random walk. Kaylin had checked out this exact street earlier that night, probably thinking this would be a great spot for some secrecy. Security footage showed him hanging around near the area where Tess's body was later found, suggesting he might have had this spot in mind from the very beginning. At just before 4 a.m., CCTV caught both Tess and Kaylin walking into the alley between the two houses on Dundonald Street. It was cold, the temperature only a few degrees above freezing, and the area was dimly lit and tucked away from the main road. That would be the last time she was seen alive. But as for Kaylin, well, the same camera would catch him leaving the area not long after. It would take 2.5 years for his trial to finally start, where, no surprise, he pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder. By the time the case got to court, public interest had hit a boiling point with many people across Canada hating the name Kaylin Schlatter. At the heart of the prosecution's case was a damning timeline carefully put together with security footage, phone data, and DNA evidence. The prosecution argued Tess did not want to be with Kaylin, nor was she interested in a romantic or sexual encounter. In fact, they painted a very clear and disturbing picture that Tess was trying to get away from him. She had even tried to call an Uber home, but Kaylin was not ready to be rejected again. He lured her into the stairwell, made a sexual move, and when she turned him down, he strangled her with her own scarf. DNA evidence backed up the prosecution's case. Not only was Kaylin's semen found on Tess's pants, but his saliva was also found on her bra, proving there was some kind of physical contact before her death. But Kaylin's defense had a totally different story. They claimed Tess was actually the one who led Kaylin to the stairwell to make out, and that while things did get physical, they didn't go all the way because Tess told him she was on her period. According to Kaylin, He then accidentally lost control in his own pants, if you know what I'm saying, before the two then parted ways nicely. Apparently Tess didn't want him to stay, and so he left her right there on the cold stairwell. He then walked part of the way back home before taking a cab and then an Uber. But his story didn't match the timeline, the physical evidence, or the forensic data. And after weeks of legal testimony, the jury came back with a unanimous verdict, finally finding Kaylin guilty of first-degree murder. The mood in the courtroom was heavy, and while Tess's family cried quietly, Kaylin showed almost no emotion at all. Just a brief nod while his eyes were down as the verdict was read out. Under Canadian law, first-degree murder comes with an automatic life sentence with no chance of parole for at least 25 years. Of course, this means Kaylin will be behind bars for a very long time. And from here on out, Kaylin would no longer be remembered as some kind of good Samaritan, but instead as a predator, a murderer, and a freak, and rightly so. You know what I find absolutely crazy here is that even after his trial and after all this evidence was laid out for the whole world to see, Kaylin still refused to admit he had murdered Tess. It's like the whole world can now really see him for what he truly is, a monster. And yet even still, he's just standing there crying with his eyes closed. Tess's family would later talk about the devastating impact of her loss and the trauma Christine went through after finding her daughter dead in a stairwell. And not surprisingly, the way the early police investigation was handled added a whole other layer of pain and frustration. But at least now, finally, justice had been partly served.
I'm just glad he's off the streets now too, and nobody else can be hurt by him ever again. Ever. I'll make sure of that too.
Sadly, Tess had to give up her life to catch a monster, but we got the monster.
The fallout from Tess's murder didn't just spark grief, it started a wave of public anger. Toronto police were at the center of this outrage, facing sharp criticism for how they handled this case. Even though Tess was reported missing almost immediately, and even though her body was only 40 meters away from where she was last seen on camera, they failed to find her in the 4 days they had before her own mother would instead. The fact that her body had been left unfound for 4 whole days, even though it was in a pretty visible area, was nothing short of infuriating. Faced with growing backlash, Toronto police started an internal review into their own handling of the case. Officials would eventually admit they had fallen short, and so after that discovery, they publicly apologized to the Richey family, but by then, the damage was already done. The case had already hit a nerve, especially among women. And once again, like we see in many of these cases, Tess's death became a cry for safer public spaces, better police response, and more awareness about violence against women.
Thank you for listening to my story.
I think one of the most haunting details of this case actually comes from the videos Tess made years before she was murdered. She had spoken openly about her fear of violence, especially from men in positions of trust. And when that fear became her reality, it left a devastating scar. It was a fear that had lived in the shadows for many, many years. And in some sick and cruel twist of fate, it would even be the thing that eventually would bring her down. And I think that's pretty much all I have for today's video. I wish I could end it on a more positive note, but unfortunately, there is nothing to say. I guess the only good thing I can say to end this video is that even though Kaylin left Tess in the dark, he is the one who will now rot in it instead. And I guess you could say that for a few minutes of control, Kaylin has now earned a lifetime without it. On that note, I'm going to wrap things up here today. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you and goodbye.